For many Formula 1 fans and drivers, it's a headache. The grid penalties. Most Grand Prix weekends, several drivers get penalties, and some weeks there are more penalties than others. But how do these penalties work? And what are the rules? This is Racing News 365 with today's answer to the question, how do grid penalties actually work? This Formula 1 season could be a very special one, not just because it's unprecedentedly exciting, but also because grid penalties could very well be a deciding factor in the championship. Let's start at the beginning. A grid penalty is a punishment which the race stewards can impose on a driver. This penalty can be imposed over the course of a Grand Prix weekend and paid back in the form of penalty places on the starting grid for the race. This is a very easy calculation. If you get a 5-place grid penalty and qualify third, you'll start the race from 8th. Grid penalties are handed out in two situations. Firstly, it could be for a violation committed by the driver during a race, qualifying or practice, for example, ignoring yellow or red flags. A recent example of an investigation was at the Dutch Grand Prix, when there was talk of a possible grid penalty for Max Verstappen because he overtook Lance Stroll while there was a red flag situation. After he was called to the stewards, it was concluded that the difference in speed between the Dutchman and the Canadian was too big, and that an overtake was unavoidable. Therefore, no grid penalty followed. A driver can also receive a grid penalty if he is clearly at fault for a crash. Valtteri Bottas received a 5-place grid penalty for his bowling ball actions at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and Max Verstappen has a 3-place penalty for Sochi after being blamed for the crash with Lewis Hamilton at the Italian Grand Prix. Another situation in which grid penalties are handed out is due to technical failures on a car. This rule is very unpopular with many Formula 1 fans because drivers are punished by failing technology. The FIA has made the following items available to each driver for a season: 3 engines, 3 MGU-Hs, 2 turbos, 2 energy stores, 2 control electronics, 3 MGU-Ks, and 8 sets of exhaust systems. If you want to know more about what an MGU-H or MGU-K is, check out the video we made about the hybrid systems. The link is in the description. As soon as a driver needs more parts than this in a season, a grid penalty will follow at the race the driver uses the parts. The first time a part is replaced, the driver gets a 10-place grid penalty. If the driver needs to replace the same part again later on in the season, for example the turbo or MGU-H, he gets a grid penalty of 5 places. Often you'll see drivers replacing multiple parts at the same time, but the rules state that when a driver gets a 15-place grid penalty, he has to start from the back of the grid. Bottas won qualifying and sprint qualifying in Italy, but started from the back of the grid having replaced his entire engine. That doesn't always have to have disastrous consequences, as a strong overtaking performance and a yellow flag allowed him to finish third. For Max Verstappen, a grid penalty is inevitable between now and the end of the season. During the British Grand Prix, he crashed into the barriers after a collision with Lewis Hamilton, making his engine unsalvageable. As a result, Verstappen was forced to use his last free engine during the Hungarian Grand Prix, while there was still 13 races to go. There's a big chance then that Max Verstappen will use his new engine at the next Grand Prix in Russia, and will thus start from the back of the grid. This has to do with several factors. Initially, Sochi has been labelled as a Mercedes circuit even before this. Sochi has been on the calendar since 2014, and since that year, only Mercedes drivers have won. In addition, Verstappen has already received a 3-place grid penalty, as he was blamed for the crash with Hamilton in Italy. Sochi, on the other hand, offers opportunities for Verstappen, because it's a circuit where there are lots of overtaking opportunities. So, with a bit of luck, Verstappen would be able to move up from last place to the top 10, or even maybe top 5. But Hamilton isn't safe for this season either, because after his engine broke down at Zandvoort, he's also working on his third and last free engine. And so it now becomes an interesting game. Should Verstappen use his new engine and thus start from the back of the grid in Russia, it could be that Mercedes decide to do the same. But on the other hand, they also have the choice to apply the grid penalties for Hamilton at a later time. For example, when the current engine is really at its maximum, or when Hamilton has an off day during qualifying and starts lower on the grid anyway. And precisely because Lewis and Max are so close to each other in the championship, an engine problem or personal error could have fatal consequences for the title. As soon as you have to replace a hybrid part or you cause a crash, you easily end up with a grid penalty of 5 places or more. So for both title contenders, it's a must to be economical with the car and not do stupid things on the track. There, now you're all caught up. Can't get enough of everything that has to do with racing? Then check out RacingNews365.com. Here you'll find the latest news, the time schedule for the Russian Grand Prix, and our live blog. Until the next time.